response would be is that racism is a women's issue. It's a feminist issue. And any feminist who argues that racism is not a feminist issue, you know, I would have serious disagreements with. Living in Canada, we know that the founding of the Canadian nation was a racial project, right? It was to build Canada as a white man's country. Aboriginal peoples were excluded and colonized in the name of racial division, racial difference. They were constructed as uncivilized, savage, lawless, right? And so race has been kind of the founding factor of Canadian nationhood. And it continues to remain so even today. So for any feminist to argue that racism isn't a feminist concern, I think is using that argument to mask white privilege and white women's privilege. I think that, you know, we're very focused on the idea of challenging and addressing racism at the level of interpersonal relations. That's where the focus is always kept, you know, and I think multiculturalism completely promotes that. It's looking at interpersonal relations and making sure that there is no racism at that level. But there isn't an understanding of racism as a structural, systemic organizing of society. There isn't an understanding of the racialization of the global economy. The whole North-South divide, colonial relations, which are now, you know, coming back to the kind of global stage with the occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq. There isn't a knowledge of history, I find often, even about Canadian history. You know, when you start off with your discussion about Canada by defining it as a liberal democracy and not as a white settler society that's trying to transform itself into a liberal democracy, you go to two very different places. So the history, there's very little knowledge of history, I think. Second thing is this focus on interpersonal relations, and so no knowledge of racialization as a kind of global historical process that plays itself out in different ways. So I think that is really important to kind of address. And I think the whole issue around feminism in this country, and I think in the US as well, is, you know, because of the middle class level of leadership and kind of white women's leadership, you know, they articulated feminist politics in the name of women's choice, you know. And again, it became a very individualized kind of politics, and this, you know, the focus on individual choice and individual rights of women is such a bourgeois project, and yet feminism adopted that in such a large way, and feminist movements did. And I think we really need to move past that. So I'm glad, you know, just to add to what.
In your plenaries talk, you mentioned women in the war itself, like soldiers and what was happening to soldiers there, but also the fact that female soldiers are being as brutal as the male soldiers. And, you know, growing up in a feminist household, I mean, a very sort of passive feminist household, I was exposed to discourses of, you know, well, if women would rule the world, it would be different. And what do we do now as feminists? How do we move forward looking at women in positions of power that are ruling the way men are?
Well, I think that this moment is really a kind of death of that kind of feminism. But I think that, you know, in terms of my own feminist commitments and my own feminist politics, the whole question of intersectionality has been really important to anti-racist feminism. It's the intersectionality of race, gender, class, and look at and other forms of oppression as well. But look at what this means in terms of, I think that thinking that we can have an absolute feminist position that will be true in every situation, or an absolute, you know, anti-racist position that will be true in every situation, is just, you know, I think we're just kind of lulling ourselves into complacency. So for me, the most important thing is intersectionality, and always the three questions: history, context, and power. Right? What is the context of this situation? What are the power relations that are being furthered here? Right? And, you know, so history, context, and power for me are absolutely vital to understanding any situation, any case that I'm looking at. And to think that I mean, the idea that women are somehow morally superior, you know, anti-racist feminists challenged that a long time ago, yes, when they revealed the complicity between feminism and colonialism, Western feminism and colonialism. the white women who came to this country as settlers did not have an alliance with Aboriginal women. You know, they did not think that if Aboriginal women were in power, things would be different. They wanted to be in power, and they built an alliance with white men in doing that. So in a way, that kind of politics has always been challenged, right? And I think that now is a time that's really showing how limited that kind of feminist politics has been, and how easily it can be hijacked, kind of despite the most sincerest commitments of feminists who held that view.